I'm going to talk to you about new models of communications and trust following the Me Too movement. So I wasn't sure I was going to have my slides, but now I do. It's great. So hi, I'm Becky Holloway. I'm Programme Director at Jericho Chambers. We're a consultancy with new models of communications, leadership and trust, and we help organisations negotiate and deliver meaningful change. We curate major programmes including responsible tax, social justice and the digital economy, housing, among others. And the past 4 years, I've been running our Good Work programme, of which diversity and inclusion is a major strand. So I'm here today to talk to you about finding solutions and resolutions for your workplaces following the Me Too movement. Now, the movement's forced organisations to take a closer look at themselves, scrutinising not only their policies, but their actual practices and conduct. Not every organisation has issues of sexual harassment, but I suspect it would be hard for any of us to find a colleague or friend who couldn't give you an example of a time they were made to feel vulnerable. And so for that reason, this topic needs to be openly addressed and scrutinised by us all. So I'm going to make 3 points. 1, sexual harassment is about power, not sex. 2, trust has been broken, and that trust needs to be rebuilt, and truth is always the primary consideration in determining trust. And 3, conversations on trust must translate into meaningful behavioural change. So firstly, sexual harassment is about power, not sex. Sexual harassment has been against the law for decades, and strong, clear laws against it are set out in the Equalities Act 2010. I'm sure you all know, I'm preaching to the choir. However, even though these laws are in place, recent reports and the Me Too movement shows clearly that there is still a real worrying problem with sexual harassment. And in 2016, the TUC's shocking report revealed that over half of women in the UK have experienced sexual harassment while at work. They surveyed over 1,500 women and discovered that 52% have been victims of unwanted sexual behaviours at work, behaviours ranging from groping to inappropriate jokes. For younger women in the workplace, aged 16 to 24, this percentage rose to 63%, with almost 20% of women reporting that the person harassing them was their manager or someone in a position of authority. Now, since the #MeToo movement has taken hold, women and men are holding people in positions of power to a much higher standard of acceptable behaviour. But we're not at the end of this yet, and we probably only touched the tip of the iceberg in terms of how many more accusations and issues are going to come out of the woodwork as this continues. But over the past year, 2 years, much has shifted in the way we talk about, experience and evaluate claims of sexual harassment in the workplace, which is great. And many powerful perpetrators have been held accountable for their actions. But we are seeing some counterproductive responses. So some men are simply choosing to avoid women. To protect themselves, they have rules about not eating with women or meeting with them alone in a conference room or mentoring them. And we've seen rigid rules such as, I'm quite short. Sorry, thanks. Now I'm going to have to read this. So rigid rules being put in place by organisations such as no eye contact for longer than 5 seconds. And these reactions indicate that, perhaps some employees don't really understand harassment and don't trust that their employers do either. At this point, I just want to differentiate between romance and sexual harassment at work. The scale of romance at work is huge. 1 in 5 people meet their partner at work. So what we don't want or need to do is ban office romances or police consenting adults or become so rigid that we're isolating women and cutting off their access to social and career growth opportunities. And these behaviours are likely already damaging organisations now. But possibly one of the most worrying statistics from reports was that that around 80% of women affected by sexual harassment did not report it, and only 1% reporting it to a union rep, which begs the question, why? And it's clear that some trust has been lost. Trust that people can work in a safe environment free from harassment, and trust that employers will hold powerful perpetrators accountable for their actions, and trust that those who speak up will be believed. So I want to talk a little bit about the dynamics of trust. So how do we move forward without making knee-jerk policy changes and really start to repair and rebuild this broken trust for everyone in the organisation? Many organisations post-Me Too actions are fueled by the desire, an understandable desire to mitigate external corporate reputational damage caused by harassment. But these reactionary efforts can be seen as window dressing and not really doing enough to achieve real change. So in a nutshell, employers who are serious about addressing harassment in the 21st century will need to be properly vulnerable. Organisations need to have brave and sometimes difficult conversations, listen and co-create the principled behaviours needed to support trust in their organisation and its collective purpose and ambition. And every organisation might be different, so it's pretty difficult. So let me expand on what I've just said. Our founder at Jericho, Robert Phillips, can't be here today, but he's an expert on trust and has researched the area extensively, and I'm borrowing deeply from his work here. Trust is a simple word for a complex idea. And trust has many intersectional nuances, cultural, geographical, moral, philosophical, belief-based, legal, political, and sometimes simply circumstantial. And if trust is broken with an external stakeholder, it's possible to walk away from the relationship and never see the other party again. But when trust is damaged or breaks down internally in an organisational setting, colleagues typically still have to work with the other party going forward. Imbalances of power add further fraction, and for this we have to acknowledge the difference that race, gender and socio-economic backgrounds make in the context of the work setting. But there's also a lack of understanding from business leaders who fail to distinguish between the drivers and manifestations of trust on an internal and external level. Many of those drivers are, of course, the same internally as externally. Honesty, competence, reliability, and benevolence are the constants of trustworthiness, as is the need to be open, transparent, and accountable, being willing to apologise when apology is properly due, a clear sense of purpose and positive societal impact, and an operational plan to deliver it, and demonstrating vulnerability and often courage. Though showing vulnerability is not easy at the best of times, especially among peers and or where empathy may be lacking and or around these thorny issues such as employee interaction and where they choose to draw the line. So this leads me to my second point. Truth is always the primary consideration in determining trust. Championing truth may sound obvious, but truth is always going to be the primary consideration when we're talking about trust. And scrutiny of truth behaves differently internally and externally. So with colleagues, more people can see you close up and for longer. They're always watching and tend to have long memories. So trust really takes time, and it's an investment in your people to build. So in workplace settings, truth must be embedded in everyday practice. And there's some ways you can do this. Number one, tell the truth, even if you can't tell the whole truth for reasons of commercial sensitivity. 2, don't make promises you can't keep. And 3, behave the same way when no one is looking. The workplace itself must include safe spaces where truthful, if occasionally difficult, conversations can thrive. And in this context, this is true of so many workplace issues, but in this context, most of the female population have accepted sexism as part of their daily life, and most of the male population have been completely oblivious to many of the nuances of this. And I think we also have to recognise the very real male fear here. And giving women a voice shouldn't mean shutting men up. That doesn't feel like progress. We need to develop language so we can have open communication between men and women about how we both feel. It's an open dialogue about what is acceptable and what isn't, and this may vary from one individual to the next and from one relationship to another. It's complicated and nuanced, and we're going to need emotional intelligence from all genders. A little bit on the relational versus transactional behaviours of trust. So trust is in itself messy enough, and internal trust is messier still. The internal-external dynamic can be considered through the lens of transactional versus relational thinking. So external trust relationships are often more binary, e.g. between a customer and a supplier, a client and a consultant, and so on. And this makes them transactional and in some ways, therefore, relatively straightforward. External trust usually requires trust judgments based on limited information, irregular interactions, lack of attention, and weaker mechanisms of accountability. Internal trust can be binary too, but internal trust is also more typically multiple, e.g. the trust between various team members, between leaders and their teams, and between in-groups and out-groups in informal organisational networks. It's therefore relational and more complex for it. Falling out with someone in the senior team is probably going to have implications for the level of trust between the individuals concerned, but beyond this, it may impact in various ways and to varying degrees on the level of trust with other team members across the team and between teams. So this is also a connectedness challenge. The order in which trust and trustworthiness are established is also important, a lack of trust internally undermines it externally because our people represent our business with stakeholders, whether customers, investors, regulators, or others. Our people need to act consistently to instill truth and trust in external stakeholders. And if they don't behave consistently internally, then they're much less likely to deliver it on themselves. So trust must start at home. I'll speed up. I want to talk a little bit about healthy skepticism. Healthy skepticism, not cynicism, skepticism, and a commitment to inquiry are also critical considerations in building trust among colleagues. Author Margaret Heffernan, she wrote Willful Blindness and often helps us out with a lot of projects. Her argument is that companies perform badly, not necessarily out of ignorance, but of a failure to look, listen, and challenge, and that real integrity flows from inquiry and a determination to ask the toughest questions of ourselves. Again, in any organisation, this has to start internally, among leadership teams and their cohorts. And the model that we've built at Jericho is built on principles of activism, participation, accountability, and dissent, and is designed so organisations can listen to meaningful cross-sections of voices and welcome scepticism as a friend, which is difficult. But where those who seek greater trust are prepared to go against the flow and eschew the temptation to be too nice, too polite, or too accommodating of the status quo, that's really where you get the results. An organisation that wants to be trusted, they need a culture of constructive challenge. So this brings me to my third point. Conversations on trust must translate into meaningful behaviour change, otherwise they're pointless. Likewise, leadership teams and entire organisations must be held accountable to their trust promises, internally and externally as well. Because of the many nuances, as I stated at the start, it's impossible to build a measurement system with universal application. Why stakeholders trust one organisation will be very different to why customers or clients trust another. And so the dynamics of internal trust similarly vary hugely from company to company, country to country, and region to region. Each company or brand should therefore define and compose its own trust score. And there's little point comparing apples and pears or building expensive measurement models to do precisely this. Employers would be better advised that rather than trying to measure trust in the generic, it's better to understand and be held accountable to the specific behaviours needed to support trust in your organisation and its collective purpose and ambition. The word trust might not even get mentioned because trust is an outcome of what we do, not we say. So in short, measuring behaviours that drive trust rather than measuring trust itself is the key to determining ultimate trust. And this approach is more robust if co-created and negotiated with those to whom the organisation, company or brand is ultimately accountable, in this case, your employees. So, in conclusion, the dog-eat-dog behaviour from leadership should be consigned to the dustbin of the 20th century, while collaboration, like empathy and courage, is essential for organisations to thrive in the 21st century business environment. Challenges should be confronted openly and respectfully. I've definitely done enough talking, but I just want to go over those 3 key points again. So sexual harassment is about power, not sex. Trust has been broken, but it can be rebuilt as long as we use truth as the primary consideration in determining that trust, and any conversations on trust must translate into meaningful behavioural change. So organisations need to have brave, sometimes difficult conversations, listen, co-create principal behaviours needed to support trust in that organisation and its collective purpose and ambition. Thank you.